Welcome to the podcast where relationships, confidence, and determination all converge into an amazing, heartfelt experience. This is Speaking from the Heart.
Welcome back to episode number 110 of Speaking from the Heart. And we're going across the pond because today we have our next guest coming all the way from England. And I really am excited to have yet another international guest on the show. Harris Eddie Hill is an out-and-proud non-binary podcaster, best-selling author, coach, and founder of the Center for Childhood Trauma Healing, a platform dedicated to supporting neurodivergent, queer, or highly empathic adults to overcome their childhood trauma and begin to thrive. Shortlisted for the Positive Impact Sustainability Speaker of the Year at the Speaker Awards, Harris is passionate about demystifying healing and helping people to connect to their own ability to heal. Clients take back their power from a medical system that doesn't always offer tangible solutions and doesn't always educate clients on their ability to heal. Harris survived and overcame trauma, unaccepting family members, cancer, abusive relationships, physical paralysis, and mental health challenges, yet has found their way to emotional freedom and is now passing that power forward. I have to tell you, I don't think I've ever had a guest that had so many multiple different situations happening, but yet has kept pressing forward, and yet has a mindset that is willing to help others, no matter what, to find the power inside of them to overcome their trauma. Harris really exemplifies for me the fact that since I started my business, I think that many people oftentimes overlook what the true value is. And when you start to talk down about something that you never understood, then maybe you're the person that's holding up this whole process for other people to be able to realize their true potential, let alone even their healing powers that will allow them to keep doing the great things that they're doing. Harris's conversation really evolved around not only public speaking, but also what they have been able to do in a variety of different formats that has not only been encouraging, but also really shows that being on multiple different platforms, multiple different areas, can really make a big difference in selling yourself and your message. But with that, let's go to the episode. All right, we're here with Harris Eddie Hill. Harris, thanks for sharing your heart with us today.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. And again, yet another international guest on the show. And I really love to have the opportunity to talk to my counterparts overseas. So thanks so much for the time difference and being able to be part of the show with us. I read your bio to the audience. And when I read it, I was thinking, wow, this person has to have an incredible story of how they got from where they were as a child to where they are today. So I'm kind of curious if you can let the audience know a little bit about your background growing up, because I feel like that's a big part of your overall story and what you have been able to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like anyone's background, it's such a mixed bag, isn't it? But I think the overarching themes, one is that I come from a family who are very funny, very witty people. Those same people also have a big history of trauma going back many generations. So it's like most people, I guess, it's a very mixed bag. And I guess the other overarching theme is sort of realizing who I was in a very traditional setting. I don't fit in terms of gender identity, sexuality, I'm autistic, ADHD. And I'm listing all these things just to kind of give you a picture, not to elicit any particular feeling, because I'm very happy to be me and I wouldn't change any of it. And I feel very comfortable, very happy about that. However, it's been such a journey to reclaim those parts and even discover what those parts were. And it was one of the reasons that I set up the Center for Childhood Trauma Healing, which we'll get onto. But so much of my story has been about recovery, not just recovering from trauma, but kind of literally recovering the parts of myself that were kind of lost along the way or that I didn't have words to name, let alone nurture. And so, yeah, a huge amount of my story has been about finding those bits again. One example is that as a child, I was very feisty. And there was a story of when I was a toddler, I was probably like 2 years old, and my parents took me on a play date with this other kid who was my age and his parents. And he snatched a toy out of my hand. And I apparently said to him, "You're supposed to say please." And I smacked him around the face.
Oh my gosh.
And apparently my parents, they did the right thing. It's not okay to hit people. But apparently secretly they were like slightly pleased about it because this kid had no manners and he was not really given, bless him, it wasn't his fault, but he wasn't really given enough instruction. So there was a part of me, not that I went out of my way to kind of be violent, but just that there was a part of me that was assertive and unafraid, and that really got kind of conditioned out of me for a really long time. And I was really taught to be fearful of anger in general and to associate anger with violence automatically. And one of the parts I recovered of myself as I got older was my anger. And not only is anger a healthy emotion, but actually it's a part of us that loves us a lot. And I had no idea that that was the case, and kind of recovering that part was I feel very kind of quite sacred thing that happened, and very important, very deep and meaningful. And that's just one of many parts. And also anger helped me to access the things I needed to access in order to heal from my trauma as well, because anger was the part that said you really didn't deserve what happened.
I don't think anybody deserves to be mistreated or
No.
feel like that they're being put into a situation where they can't fight back or feel like they can be their authentic self. And I feel like I've had plenty of those experiences. I relate to you being in the neurodivergent category myself as it comes to addressing and even understanding how our bodies interact with not only the emotional tolls sometimes that it comes with having that different brain style, but also interacting with different people as a whole. But you remind me of the fact that I'll have to say please and thank you because I don't want to be smacked by you. I do not want that to happen. So thank you so much for being on the show. Please enjoy yourself while being here.
Thank you.
With all kidding aside, Harris, I'm curious, how did you go about finding this realization that you were stymied or maybe pushed down and being able to find and explore yourself again? Because I often work with that in my coaching business, and I help people to find that voice within themselves. And we all take different tracks in which we're able to navigate through that. And I'm just curious, with all the things that you've been through, how did you do that for maybe the audience's awareness? Because maybe somebody is struggling with the same things that you have been through, and they're trying to figure out how to get around that.
Yeah, so I guess everybody's kind of awakening or kind of becoming aware of this thing. That can look 1,000, a million different ways. And my thing was that at the age of 25, I went along for a routine appointment at my doctor's. I totally forgot about it, and they found some early cancer. And I went literally overnight from having spent years being very kind of codependent. A lot of people don't know what that means from a psychology point of view. Codependent is when you are completely others focused at your own expense. So that's the people who are chronic people pleasers. And again, this is not a criticism whatsoever. It's just helpful to have the language. And often we've developed this kind of survival mechanism of codependency because we've come from a difficult situation. So total compassion for everyone who's been through that, including myself. So I went from sort of being this doormat and being really walked all over by anybody who wanted to, and not advocating for myself, being scared to say no, and then had this real big health scare. And suddenly I cared what happened to me. I had this real strong sense of like, I could have lost me. I've taken myself for granted this whole time. And it really woke me up, and it started to change my life. Like, not overnight, I did a lot of growing. So that year they removed the bit of cancer. I went for a test 6 months later. They're like, you're all clear, it's all done. So that was great news, but it changed. I cut off friends that year. I think 2 days after I got that news, I broke up with a partner at the time who was quite narcissistic. Whether or not she actually has the disorder or not, I will never know. And I guess most of the time, we'll never know if people are narcissistic because they're unlikely to ever be in front of anyone who has the power to do that diagnosis. So much of that conversation is a guess. But anyway, so I ended that relationship, I ended friendships, and I started what was to become a very long addiction to audiobooks around the self-help stuff, spiritual stuff, emotional intelligence, maturity, development, healthy relationships, all of this kind of stuff. I did a huge amount of work around that. And I think about 3 years after I'd kind of been through that awakening, I don't have another word to better describe it, I dated somebody else, and I had had a break all of that time. I was like, I need to work on myself because I'm pretty sure that I'm part of the problem, even though no one had told me that. And I'm not saying that as a self-criticism, but rather that I was playing a role that wasn't helpful. And the people that I was attracting to play the complementary role were not the people that I wanted.
It sounds like almost a self-awareness factor that you were trying to develop while you were going through that. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And so 3 years later, when I was 28, I dated this new person. She was so lovely, like a really lovely person, but emotionally fairly unavailable. And I look back now and I actually think like I did such a good job for someone who's come from my background. And at the time I didn't know that I had all these different problems that were getting, but I did such a good job of starting that relationship being like very grounded, very secure. And then as things started to go wrong, I started to almost slightly revert back to my old codependency. Again, I didn't know that's what it was called. It was a very visceral, intuitive thing, and I didn't have words for. And me reverting into that probably pushed her away and was kind of the final straw. And so that relationship ended. And I said to my friend, I started therapy at that point because that beginning of us separating, even just emotionally, had triggered a bit of anxiety. So around the same time, I started going back to therapy. And my therapist, she had trained in some alternative things. And she said, what do you want to do about your PTSD? I had raging PTSD from childhood sexual assault. I won't go into any detail because I don't want to trigger the people that might need to hear what the rest of what I'm going to say. But it was a one-off that happened when I was a child. And in all that time afterwards, I had suffered really bad with PTSD. I only had to read like the headline of a newspaper or something, and I would be very badly triggered. I've locked myself in cars before, in bathrooms. It's been proper scary. And this therapist was like, well, do you want to get rid of your PTSD? And I was like, what do you mean? I'd asked for help for nearly 20 years. And she was the first person to say, you can treat it. And I was like, oh my God, like, sign me up immediately. Can we do it now?
Yes.
And she was like,
give me the paperwork right now. Yes.
Yes. And she was like, well, we have to do some groundwork first, but that's what we can do. And I was like, oh, amazing. So I had this like real sense of I can heal this. And at the same time, I said to one of my friends, I said, listen, no one's listening to me, but I know that I am the common denominator in my relationships. I'm choosing the wrong people repeatedly, and I know it's me. And again, it wasn't self-criticism. I felt very strongly, intuitively, that I was doing a role that I didn't want to do, but that role was attracting the people that I was getting. I want to change the equation. And she said, you need to read this book called The Human Magnet Syndrome. And so I absorbed it as quickly as I possibly could. And then my life made sense. My relationships made sense. Like it was such a beginning of a new version of myself that was really helpful and much happier, and having amazing relationships with other human beings in general. I used to be very introverted. I used to have a panic attack standing up to speak for 1 minute in like a networking setting. And now part of my business and how I get my message out there is talking to people in this kind of public setting all the time and loving it. So it's been a big change.
I feel like you're doing such a great job in doing that. Is just talking to you for the first 14 minutes here of our conversation, because for some people, even just doing that for a minute, I remember those days of even going to a networking event myself and shutting down because I had
Mm.
so much stimuli and I didn't understand that. But then someone also said, hey, maybe you need to check out this. And that's when I led myself into Toastmasters International, great organization helping with public
Yeah.
speaking and leadership. And I think we all find into things that we want to surround ourselves with, but we often need help to identify where those things might be stemming from, which that leads me into what I really want to talk about with you, which is the Center for Childhood Trauma Healing that you started. And first off, hearing your story, it makes perfect sense as to why you wanted to start this. You want to help others, you want to give them the freedom that you have found. But I feel like this organization that you started does so much more. So I'm wondering if you could tell a little bit about not only the center and why you thought that was really important to start it because of the context that we're just talking about, but also share with us, how can somebody that might be going through something, especially I know that you're overseas, but maybe somebody in the United States wants to come check this out. Maybe they're looking for an international avenue. Maybe you can share a little bit about how that process would begin. So I'll give you that opportunity to talk about it because I'm really fascinated. And I wish that there was something like this that was around when I was a kid, maybe
Yeah.
even now for that matter.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, it's a short answer where that's concerned. I work online with anyone, so providing you're over 18 or whatever your law says about being an adult, then I can work with people online, so it's not a problem. But yeah, what I want to do with the centre is not only to help individuals to actually recover from their trauma permanently, because that's exactly what happened to me. And when I was first told, like, you can just not have trauma anymore, I was like, how does that work though? I had so many questions. And this was coming from somebody that I knew had perfect integrity. I knew that when she said, this is something we can do, it was totally coming from the heart. She really meant what she was saying. So I was like, I'm not being missold anything here. I just have no idea how this works. And then by the time I went through the process, it was so quick. PTSD that I'd lived with for just about 20 years that was so severe was gone in 2 hours. And I know that sounds radical, and I guess it is, but at the same time, once you understand that all you're doing essentially is that you're giving your brain the opportunity to move through and process that thing that happened permanently. And this isn't a talking, you don't do it through talking therapy. You're giving your brain a literal experience. The brain doesn't easily know the difference between what's imagination and what's real. And so we basically use that mechanism to give your brain the ending it needed to certain things. Now, obviously, when we get to complex trauma, when you've lived in an environment for a long period of time, either with partners or family, or maybe you grew up in a group home or anything like that, any environment that you've been in long term that over time has given you a certain kind of trauma, it's a little bit more complicated. We have to work out the things that it made you believe about yourself, about the world, about other people, about relationships being safe or not safe, about second you see a red flag, is it a normal problem that lots of people have in relationships, or is it really a red flag? What do green flags feel like? It's not just look like, it's feel like. And also to start to begin to realize that your body actually knows a huge amount about this already, and getting yourself to communicate with your body again, because often that stuff all shuts down. It's a subtle system that I think is much more difficult to access if you're traumatized or you're in a dangerous environment.
I have to say, as part of that, that our bodies sometimes don't even know that our brain is trying to respond to something, but yet we're ignoring it because we're not self-aware. So there's kind of like a duality
Yeah.
happening where there is some sort of defense mechanism. I almost want to call it that, to activate to protect ourselves, while at the same time, it's probably not a good thing either that it's being activated, because then we shut down. We are not having that opportunity to really explore, engage, figure out what it is that we have to do to respond differently. And I know even for myself, I've had to relearn and retrain how to handle a variety of different social situations because of the autism that I suffer. Well, not suffer, but I embrace, but I also change as well. So I hear what you're saying with that. And I think that's really important distinction, especially for those that don't have any sort of connection with it. But I'm sorry to interrupt. I really wanted to point that out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, every person's kind of relationship with their body and their feelings is so different. You get some people who turn up and actually they're very practiced at being angry, but they're not so practiced at being vulnerable. So there are always different sides to these things, and there's no one way to be traumatized, unfortunately. Yeah.
I find that to be really true. And actually, what I noticed is that there's actually a free resource that you offer. It's an essential audiobook list for survivors of childhood trauma, and
Yeah.
that it helps to create that framework. So I was wondering if you want to talk about that a little bit and how people could access that, especially since it's free. And I love free stuff.
Yeah, so I just noticed. So basically, before I set up the centre, I went to go and work for the NHS, which is our National Health Service. I went to be a coach. I was coaching people through all sorts of different things like diabetes and their relationship with food, anything they wanted support with, that they would come to talk to me about it, and we would talk strategies and everything else. And the thing that kept coming up was childhood trauma. A lot of people don't know that they've got childhood trauma. They might tell you, oh, well, this thing happened with my parents, or my dad or my mum was very controlling, or I wasn't allowed to cry. They sound on their own kind of like, yes, I'm acknowledging that there was something difficult, but overall things were okay. And actually, regardless of how you might score it from good to bad on a piece of paper, a lot of us, most of us, I would say, have some level of trauma. So I also noticed that the same books, audiobooks that I was recommending over and over again were the same four. And I began to realize that those were the missing pieces for most people. These four books I recommend in my guide, which is free to download. And obviously it talks about each book and roughly the picture that each book will help you to build. And to me, there's sort of four pillars of the things that you need in order to start having healthier relationships, start to transform yourself to be that healthy component of your own relationships, and also to spot things in people, not necessarily so that you can label and reject them, although sometimes that is necessary, unfortunately, but to understand how to navigate those difficulties, because most people are imperfect, if not everybody. Even if they're like really healthy at relationships, there might just be one area here or there that they're not experienced with or they don't know how to handle. So I think having the language around that is really helpful. And the four books explore things like the balance between being self-focused and others-focused, which is really important to have a good balance between self and others. A lot of us overgive and overfunction. Who's going to enjoy that more than people who are inherently extremely selfish? That's one book. Another book, we talk about vulnerability and how we can do that in a healthy way and with the right people, because actually you could be doing vulnerability really well but have no idea that you're doing it with the wrong people, and therefore it can kind of kick you in the bum. And
Yes, I've been kicked in the bum many times.
yeah.
Or in the butt here in the United States.
Yeah.
So yes, I totally understand that.
And then the other one is attachment. This was a really big one. 2 years after I had that really lovely relationship with this lady, I dated another trans non-binary person. And at the end, when that also unfortunately ended, they said, you know, you're really triggered considering how well we managed to end this relationship. It was very respectful. And yet I was massively triggered. And I was like, yeah, I think you're right. And so I went away and I found out that there was this thing called attachment. There's a lot of attachment stuff out there. I don't rate all of it because I think some of it's quite biased. And that's why I like the book that's in my guide, because it's very unbiased. It talks to all the different parts, and it also gives you some healing that you can start doing with the book there and then. So attachment plays a big part. And then the last part talks all about emotional immaturity. And I think if we've come from a background where folks are traumatized, their interpersonal skills are needing some work, then we might not have a very good idea of what emotional maturity looks like. So I think that's also a really good place to start. And those four topics together, I think, not only help you heal, but help you to start building this idea in your mind of what healthy looks like. Because a lot of us have no idea what that looks like. And it's a bit of a shot in the dark, really.
It is. And for those that are interested in those resources, or you know someone that might be, I will link that into the episode notes, which is also for Harris's website as well. So you can find all of that available along with the Center for Childhood Trauma Healing. Harris, I want to talk a little bit about your podcast, because being a podcast host myself, I always enjoy the different varieties of podcasts that are out there. And you have been a host of a few of them. You actually have been in the process of a recently new one called It's Only Trauma that you're starting to launch. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your podcast, and maybe there might be some appeal for even some of my listeners to go over and listen to some of those episodes as well. So do you mind describing a little bit, especially about It's Only Trauma, since that is recently new?
Yeah, so we are recording for it right now. This is a friend of mine. In fact, she was the same friend who put me onto the Human Magnet Syndrome book. She knows absolutely loads about healthy relationships and is also ADHD, and has been really focused on things around codependency, counterdependency, narcissism, and she also studies somatics. I'm a very big picture person. I think a lot about how healthiness feels and how unhealthiness feels when it comes to our relationship. And a lot of the work that I do, the coaching and the healing that I do, is kind of around the mental health space, energy, and I guess energy healing, if you're into that kind of thing. And inner child work, it's very much that. And she is really good at the details. She's much more a details person, whereas I'm big picture more. And our areas really complement each other. We have these very deep chats, and I realized this year I'm in this post-trauma phase now, because I've done the work on my simple PTSD, I've done the work on my complex PTSD. And coming out the other side of it now, I'm realizing that there's so much of life that I want to do in community and with others. And I realized that a lot of the podcasts I listen to the most religiously are with podcasts that have permanent co-hosts, because it kind of feels to me like you're at the kitchen table with these people, and that it feels like such a lovely space to kind of be in. And I realized that I wanted that, and I really wanted to do a podcast and produce something. I always feel like podcasts and businesses are like little babies that you're sort of rearing into these kind of fully fledged beings. And I was like, I want to raise the next podcast with another sort of co-host, a co-parent of my podcast baby. So
I'm going to think for the rest of the day after listening to this, I have a baby that I've been birthing here. And that's quite unusual, especially for some of my closest friends that listen to this. Yes, I do not have the ability to give birth, ladies and gentlemen.
It's so interesting because I'm in my mid-30s, and a lot of the people around me is at that age where they're either having or have had children, or actually it's kind of looking like they don't want them. And I remember when I've never had a hang up about my ages ever, except for my 27th birthday. And it was because at 27 is when my mum had me. I'm the eldest of three. And by that point, my dad had a mortgage, and we're married and stuff. And I remember that the night before my 27th, I was just like in the kitchen. And you know, when you've got that frown that like children have, where the bottom lip comes out and they're like really grumpy. And I was like crying a little bit. My mum was like, "What's the matter?" And I was like, "I'm 27 and I haven't done anything." And at that point, I had 3 other businesses. She was like, "You've got 3 businesses." And I was like, "Oh, yeah." So I think in my mind, in order to cope with where I am in life, it's not that deep, but I do get comparisonitis occasionally. And so I like to think of the fact that all the things I've done with my life, instead of the sort of quote unquote traditional things, has been around business and podcasts and stuff. I like to think of the things that I create and put out into the world instead of having babies.
Well, if that's the case, you've had many of them, not only
Yeah.
the biggest one being the center, but I mean, we didn't even get into the fact that you've been a best-selling author, you've been a speaker, I mean, all those different things. And we're almost out of time to be able to talk about all those things. But I will say that for what you just said, it's really important to note that it can be wherever you want it to be. It can be multiple different types of things. And the fact that you've been able to overcome that, to be able to say, yeah, there's some struggles. I might still fall, but you brush the dirt off and you keep moving forward. And that says a lot about who you are, definitely. Harris, I want to give you the last few minutes. Tell us a little bit about how people can access the center if they are interested in learning a little bit more about it. Maybe you might want to talk about maybe some of the books that we haven't talked about if they're interested. Maybe you want to give a quick plug about some of those that maybe they might be interested in reading. You are a speaker, so if you want to even pitch yourself, I know you're a coach. I know you're taking clients as well. I'm going to let you just go run wild here the last few minutes of who you want to share about who you are, Harris Eddie Hill, and maybe give some people some perspective how they contact you. So last few minutes are yours.
Thank you. So the best place to check me out is my website, which is mooksharrishill.com. Joshua will put the link in the notes. It's got everything on there. So there's a webinar on there. You can watch it like right now. It's already recorded. It teaches you about how trauma works in the brain, how we overcome it. I give some really good examples of like how that works and that it's a simple process. The skill is in having a professional, someone like me, it doesn't have to be me, but somebody like me tailoring the treatment to you, because two people can go through the same thing and they can come out with totally different traumas. So there is no one size fits all, but it's definitely doable. I've had people come up to me and say, oh, is this trauma a lot? And I'm like, if you can describe to me roughly either how it happened or what effect it's having on you now, we can definitely do something about it. My main one-to-one program that I work with people is healing your childhood trauma in 90 days. It doesn't mean we get rid of literally every single thing that's in there, but we get rid of most of it. And after that, if you need to come back for like one appointment here or there, then it's pretty easily done. And also, I think once you start to experience what it is to properly heal from trauma, and you're like, oh, it is difficult, don't get me wrong, you'll probably cry, you will need tissues, it might not be graceful, but it should be fairly one and done. It should be that once we've processed something, that thing should be kind of done with. There might be other bits kind of surrounding it, but it's a fairly quick process. People often think that processing trauma permanently should take years, and actually it's one of the things that I'm the most passionate about in my work, is educating people that actually trauma healing can happen as quickly as the trauma happened, if you see what I mean. We're giving the brain an opportunity to have an experience in the direction that you want to have it in, and it's pretty magical stuff. So that's that. The books that I've done are not related to trauma work, but you're very welcome to have a look. The first one is called Thriving in Business Strategies for the LGBTQ plus Entrepreneur. It was the first queer business book to ever be published, and it created some waves in the US as well. I was the only British author. You can read about that on my website if you want to. And the second co-authored book that came out on 1st of February 2023 is called 28. And it was about all of us who grew up going to school in the era where discussing homosexuality at school was illegal, and how that kind of left the door open for us to be mercilessly bullied and harassed and sometimes assaulted. So it's an anthology of works. It's really important, especially in today's climate where, especially in our country, in the UK, queer rights are taking a bit of a beating at the moment. And I think it's good to remember why we don't want that to happen, and we don't want that to happen to other kids.
Wow, Harris, I have to say, you have led a not only an impeccable life thus far, especially be at a young age. I'm 37 and I have gone through quite a number of things and have not yet started a lot of the different things that you've already accomplished. So for that said, you definitely have a lot of notches in your belt. But
Thank you.
even with all those things said, what strikes me quite uniquely, unlike other guests that I've had on the show, is that you have this uncanny ability to eloquently talk about things that for other people, once they start even opening up about it, they instantly break down. And I think that is just one of those stigmas that we need to dispel and be able to have that conversation. And I think you are breaking some of those things, even internationally, that definitely need to continue to have that conversation. So Harris, thanks for being on Speaking from the Heart. It really means a lot for you not only to share your story, but to share who you are, which I think you are one of those authentic individuals. So for that, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's such a lovely compliment. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank Harris so much for spending some time with me to perform this interview and really figure out what is really happening, not only in their life, but also understanding why it's so important to keep pressing forward, especially if there's so many different obstacles that might face you. Not only the things that you might need to do, but the people that could stand in your way at the same time, especially if you have a differing opinion. Now, I must admit, this show has always been incredible to me with the number of different people that have not only come across my desk wanting to have an interview, but also what they wanted to share as a story. All kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different things that they're working on, whether they're really successful, whether they have overcome trauma to be really successful, or they have an important message that they want to share with all of you, my listeners. I think every time that we have somebody that has been able to push the status quo, I've been able to grow just alongside of you. But Harris's story is a little bit different today that I want to break down as to why they are so much different than maybe some of my other guests that I've had. And it's really starting with the fact that trauma could lead us out of the things that we've had problems with, but if we let that grow inside of ourselves and make us feel really terrible about what we have made as choices, of course we're going to have problems not only with feeling a little bit better about ourselves, but also being able to find our best versions of ourselves in the long run. But I think trauma, especially with what Harris does, helps us to find who we are, what these things are that we really want to have. But we don't want to change anything about ourselves at the same time. Maybe we're just so complacent about what we're able to accomplish that we can do the great work that we're doing by just standing still, which is a very interesting take. If you are doing things already that are really awesome in itself, why do you need to change or conform to somebody else? And they gave some tips that I think might be very helpful for all of us to understand. Being assertive. Don't be afraid. Don't have any fear. Be able to love other people as part of the recovery that they might be going through. All of these might seem very simplistic, but Harris brings up a very good point, that we all navigate in a variety of different ways in terms of the problems that we have and the ways in which we solve them. That's why we're all unique. And whether you want to think about the fact that it's really about these people that are trying to find their best versions of themselves, it also means understanding, too, that our journeys, no matter which way you look at it, are unique in their own way. But also, especially when you look at the international perspective, what kinds of resources are available as well to help people navigate through pain, trauma, processing all the different emotions that are involved, but more importantly, how you can get yourself to the other side without compromising yourself. I think that we look at the human magnet syndrome, as Harris was mentioning, about how we even attract to each other. We don't want to do something that we don't want to do, but at the same time, we're led down this path of not only of group thinking, but we do things that we oftentimes don't even realize are protecting ourselves. Because I look at even the things that I have done in my life, whether they are something that I've done out of fear or retribution or even something else. But the brain does some interesting things from a psychological standpoint that really helps us to understand why we create some of the situations that we're in the first place. But this is where it becomes really important when our brain does do that. We need to be able to find the tools in order to start addressing what is needed to be done. What are the mechanisms, in other words, that we can create in our lives so that we can always fall back on new habits as opposed to bad habits? And that in itself is such a challenging status quo that we need to be able to overcome. Whether we really think that we are doing that or not, it cannot really be relied upon by what we are doing by ourselves. We need to have that second perspective. We need to be able to understand what is really happening in our lives. So when we become vulnerable, when we detach from some of the things that are really holding us back, especially childhood trauma, which Harris has even digged into a little bit on today's show, it helps us to understand how much emotional immaturity we might really have in handling a lot of these issues. Oh yes, Emotional immaturity. I think that we don't even realize that sometimes we're so immature about the ways in which we process things. It's usually our default reaction to go to really screaming at the top of our lungs. It might be even holding us back from being able to see our true potential by seeing all the time how we're being screwed over by that person and just thinking that, man, they're a terrible human being, and that's all we can say. It's odd to really think about that because when you look at the bigger picture, we would never tell them that they're immature or stupid to their face. Of course, it seems like our moral standard, even here in the United States, has loosened up quite a bit, that now we see a lot of people swearing to each other, telling them that they're idiots, or goddamn idiots, if you will, and even thinking about the fact that sometimes the ways in which we react to the politicians that are in the media, the celebrities that make dumb mistakes, the gossip that we see in tabloids, it all accumulates from the fact that we, at its heart, rely on jealousy, rage, and even talking bad about other people to get over some of the problems that we have. Maybe that is what we call emotional immaturity. But then Harris said something that is really fascinating to me that I've had other guests on this show already talk about, but the way they talked about it today really made a big difference. It's about the way in which we can heal using our energy, the inner child work, to be able to understand why we make the decisions that we do. Getting to that other side, of which you want to discuss what might be happening in the current space that you're in, the comfort zone that you are in, and maybe even sitting at the kitchen table to have that type of conversation, especially when it comes to the energy and even the different types of things that have happened in our life, all accumulated into something that I think we start to understand a little bit better about, which is our emotional response. I don't know about you, but I feel that every time I hear a conversation today about why somebody shouldn't do a certain thing or have a certain idea or understand a certain concept in which they process in a different way, it makes me feel like they are not respecting the fact that everyone has a different opinion and they're entitled to it based on what they're going through. So maybe even today's lesson is about tolerance and respecting what other people have to say, what they actually bring to the table. Trauma does those sort of things in which they hold us back from being able to see the best versions of who we are. We have to understand that trauma, though, isn't a wall that holds us back from being able to see what we can ultimately achieve. What can we ultimately accomplish? If we're able to understand that trauma in itself is really a way that we process in our brains the toxicity of something that has happened to us, and instead use that energy pattern for a much better good, instead of holding on to it like we're a small child, perhaps we can do some work on ourselves that make us not only a little bit more mature as an adult, but also help us to keep moving forward, personally, professionally, and with our businesses. Speaking in itself, which we had talked about quite a lot in this episode, really demonstrates to me that we have to communicate. Harris's accomplishments really speak to that, especially with being able to understand how patterns of healing can transfer even with the messages that we have, nonverbal and verbally, to somebody else, without us even knowing, for that matter. We're able to understand quite clearly how that messaging and how that impact on others makes such a significant difference. Of course we're going to do so much better. Of course we're going to be able to get a much better relationship with somebody else. Of course we're going to be a lot more confident about the way in which we pursue our goals, dreams, aspirations. But more importantly, how we stay determined through all those things, regardless of the world that's changing all around us, means that we have to have a voice in which is wrapped around all the things that we really believe in ourselves, regardless of our background, orientation, creed, or cultural stances, or social engagements. It means that we have to be able to accept all of those things in a brand new way. Harris's conversation today, I think, exemplifies the fact that we need to look at these things and we need to continue to pay attention to them, because not just one person has talked about it on this show. And it means that even in the future, we have to keep looking at how these conversations, how we can not be afraid of having those conversations, can make such a big difference of how we can love ourselves and love each other. If we can navigate them in a different way, in which we use all the different types of resources, including even some of the free audio resources that I will put in the episode notes based on Harris's conversation today, I think that will help us to get to that other side. I think that will allow us to have comfort where sometimes comfort isn't seen. I think it will allow us to open a dialogue at the kitchen table. But more importantly, it will allow us to really see the best versions of ourselves. And I think the best versions mean that we have to let go of what has happened. To know that even if those things drive us and motivate us, it doesn't mean that it has full control anymore. We have a voice that allows us to be at the table. And it means that we have to be able to keep speaking about it. Whether it's through a podcast, whether it's through writing, whether it's being a coach, or even if you have founded a nonprofit that's geared towards helping others, just remember, no matter what kind of impact, big or small, it all starts with us. If you are holding on to something today, let it go. If you really want to make a big difference in your life, be a little bit more vulnerable. And if you want to have a little bit more healing in the process, attune to your energy, create that work that's inside of you, create that desk space that allows you to work on yourself. And trust me on this. You're going to not only work on yourself, but you're going to work on everybody else at the same time. And I think they're going to learn a little bit about you, no matter what kind of background you have, trauma or not. Thanks for listening to episode number 110 of Speaking from the Heart. And I look forward to hearing from your heart very soon.
Thanks for listening. For more information about our podcast and future shows, search for Speaking from the Heart to subscribe and be notified wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit us at www.yourspeakingvoice.biz for more information about potential services that can help you create the best version of yourself. See you next time.